So I'm carrying on reviewing in a different key, and this is video number 2. So again, the book does look at Asperger's. Most of the book is actually about classic autism, and it focuses more heavily on Kanner's type of autism, autism with intellectual disabilities. Asperger doesn't receive much, isn't really talked about a lot in this book, but it does look at Asperger's a little bit, more towards the end of the book. And it talks about someone called Alex, who was diagnosed with Asperger's age 9 in the USA. Most of the people talked about in this book are from the USA because its authors are American, so it only talks about British autism history briefly. Alex was born in 1986. It talks a bit about his development. He was one of the earliest Asperger diagnoses back in the 90s. He startled easily as an infant. He never relaxed into his mother's arms. He had no patience for being read to or for snuggling, and he would scream for hours. He span and never seemed to get dizzy. He flapped his hands when excited. He covered his ears to shut out sound. So some very kind of classic autistic behaviours here. But, however, unlike, say, classic autism, he hit all of the expected milestones for intellectual development. He spoke on normal time. He had a high IQ, the highest score in the school's history. Alex began wanting to have friends, but was shunned. He had an unusual ability to stay focused where other kids grew restless. You could take him to concerts, and Alex, even as a young boy, was able to sit perfectly still and attention focused intently on sounds the orchestra was making. But in sports, in basketball for example, he was unable to figure out the mechanisms of timing needed to interact with other players in throwing or catching passes, and his approach to making friends was awkward. He would simply walk up to people and ask to be friends. That's what I did. I did that. He corrected teachers when they were wrong. By 3rd grade, being in America, Alex's parents had brought him to several specialists. He was diagnosed with ADHD, OCD, but none of it really captured what made him different, until he was diagnosed with Asperger's. His parents knew of no other children with this label. It was the first time they heard of it. The first time they heard of it was from the psychiatrist in 1995. There were no books on it. Another mother in the USA went through exactly the same thing when her son received his diagnosis in 1993. Her paediatrician didn't know anything about Asperger's. She called doctors, all of whom said they had never seen a case. The mother went online, and in the late 1990s she set up the first online discussion group devoted to the subject, and she named this Oasis. I actually remember Oasis because it was actually one of the first Asperger's websites that I landed on, so that's interesting. But in 2004, a new Asperger's site appeared. The site was the work of a teenager, aforementioned 17-year-old Alex Plank, and he called it Wrong Planet Syndrome because he wanted company. I don't know if any of you have been on Wrong Planet. It's still actually going, by the way. And again, it was one of the first forums I went on as well. Now, Alex was drawn to computers. He spent hours teaching himself to program. And he talked a lot about something called Aspie pride, this idea that autism is a good thing. I fundamentally disagree there. And that's the thing, Aspie, it turned into this whole kind of almost Aspie supremacist movement, but that's another debate. And then it quotes from Uta Frith, who says, the well-known autism researcher Uta Frith, she says, "Surely everyone is a little bit autistic on occasion. I too," she said, "would sometimes like to claim a dash of autism for myself." Don't know what that means. And one t-shirt read, "Socially awkward, intellectually advanced." Sounds a little bit kind of, a little bit supremacist, to put it mildly. So Aspie, it talks a bit about Aspie superiority. And then there's retro-diagnosing of historical figures as well. Very much a big figure, but Aspies often like to retro-diagnose historical figures. For example, the book Norm Leging's Diagnosing Jefferson was devoted to attempting to prove that America's 3rd president had Asperger's. The amateur diagnosis of autism became almost a little bit of a trend, arguably trivialising it. But had Alex been born just one generation earlier, the chances of his success story being associated with the word autism would have been nil. It's hard to imagine that a clinician examining someone as talkative and innovative as Alex in 1975 would even have entertained a diagnosis of autism. But Alex was born in the era of the spectrum, the book says. Those who saw no evidence of impairment in Alex's performance in front of big audiences were not aware of what his childhood was like, and the effort and practice he put in, actively studied behaviours of people, and then memorised them, note by note, like the songs he learned to play on a piano as a kid. Now, another prominent Aspie, Michael John Carley, he was diagnosed aged 36 in 2000, shortly after his young son was diagnosed. And he's a gifted writer, and he produced plays. He's a playwright and a guitarist who performed in clubs, and he worked for a series of non-profits, and he participated in AIDS projects overseas. Again, he's from the USA. So even if he and Planck were constantly working to compensate for their social deficits, their success and eloquence only showed their effort was paying off. It normalised autism, the ability to get along in the real world. But their presence in autism conversation upset what had been one of its assumptions. The consensus dating back to the 1960s that most people with autism were also intellectually disabled. But this was before a spectrum, when the definitions were different. Again, it talks about the neurodiversity movement, but it doesn't talk about it for too long. Most of the book isn't focused on the neurodiversity movement, it's only more at the end. So the neurodiversity movement traced back to 1993, where a 31-year-old man called Jim Sinclair stood in front of an audience of parents at an autism conference in Toronto, and it was really a sort of an autistic man's manifesto. And he said that autism parents were part of the problem. Don't mourn for us, he said. Grief is not called for. The parents had insulted the children's humanity. When parents say, I wish my child did not have autism, what they're really saying is, I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, he said. I don't actually see that at all myself, personally. I think parents should be perfectly entitled to say they wish their children didn't have autism. Because I would say that myself, if I was lucky enough to have a kid, and I can't have kids, but if I did have a kid, and I wouldn't want them to be autistic, it's a hell of a hard life. And if they were autistic, I think I'd be well within my rights to say I wish they weren't autistic. I don't understand why some of these neurodiversity movement advocates are so opposed to that. And I think it's kind of, again, this whole kind of Aspie supremacist stuff, but that'll take another video. In a way, the book argues, this is kind of reminiscent of Bettelheim. Bettelheim, by the way, was a psychoanalyst who came out with the whole idea that autism was caused by refrigerator parenting. His claim that mothers harboured a secret wish that it was much better if their child wouldn't live, and that this psychological desire somehow caused the child's autism. And that was back in the 1960s. So this Aspie supremacist stuff about parents don't mourn for us, in some ways it's kind of a bit reminiscent of early psychoanalysis and the idea that parents brought the child's autism on themselves, kind of thing, by being cold and indifferent to their child, which is kind of a bit ironic. A distant echo of mother blaming. Now, Sinclair was not a father. He didn't have an autistic child, let alone be a father. So these parents who he spoke to had extremely disabled kids. Yes. So he takes. So in a sense, elements of mother blaming going on. And he kind of criticised them for not trying hard enough to relate to their kids. He says it takes more work to communicate with someone whose native language is not the same as yours. So the central tenet of the neurodiversity movement was that autism was but one more way of being human. Since being human required no cure, autism didn't need a cure either. That seems to me a little bit of a strange argument, leaping from one to the other like that. Now, the coinage neurodiversity is actually credited to an Australian sociologist called Judy Singer from the 1990s. And in 1998, an autistic woman known as Muskeen Muskie set up a mock website for a fake organisation she called the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical, and she called this NT syndrome. She called it a neurobiological disorder characterised by a preoccupation with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity. Yeah, a lot of these neurodiversity movement advocates do that, and I think it's funny. I don't think it's funny. I think it's just taking the piss out of a serious disorder, personally. But in 2006, almost no one had ever heard of neurodiversity. Things were much better then, in some ways. I was diagnosed in 2008, and it still wasn't really talked about at that point. And this was frustrating to those who saw autism as central to their identities and not an emergency. And someone called Ari Neiman from the USA, he founded the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, and their motto was borrowed from the Disability Rights Campaign of the 1990s, nothing about us without us. So I agree with that. Yeah, I definitely agree with that a bit. So not all parts of the neurodiversity movement I'm opposed to, by the way. They do say come out with some progressive stuff. But he prized his autistic identity. He despised the messaging of Autism Speaks, the puzzle piece logo, and he founded ASAN in 2006. And he opposed many of the avenues of scientific investigation that Autism Speaks endorsed. For example, things that forced people to stifle their autistic self to seem more normal, applied behaviour analysis and drugs. For Neiman, nothing was more terrifying than the search underway to unravel autism's genetic underpinnings to identify risk genes and targets for future treatment. Okay, that's interesting. I find that interesting. I want to know the genes for autism. I really do. I just don't get these people. You know my views on the neurodiversity movement, generally speaking, very anti. It pointed to multiple paths to autism. If it pointed to multiple paths, and autism could be genetic, tested. He feared eugenic abortion as for Down syndrome is a bit extreme. Now, parents hated being lectured to by verbal, car-driving, college-attending grown-ups. I'm not surprised. Some parents thought they recognised such a failure of empathy in his pronouncements about them as parents, or failure of tact, that they took it as evidence that he matched the stereotype of Asperger's. So yeah, is kind of true, actually. Although many people with Asperger's supremacy deny that they lack empathy or struggle with it. Most parents supported the first part of the NDM argument, the acceptance by community and work opportunities, but not the don't cure bit. People were forgetting that those with autism with severe impairments who would never speak. Neiman had never lived with anyone like this or cared for them. Neiman refused to make place for affection of his audience, even face to face with an autism mum whose total love for a child and despair over his future should have been evident. Neiman was unyielding. He did not offer any sympathy. And it was experiencing this lack of sympathy that an autism mum went home thinking that people who still doubted Neiman and true autistic impairments were wrong. The total imperviousness with an inability to take on the point of view of others other than his own amounted to mind blindness. Now, Simon Baron-Cohen held that this cognitive style interferes with the experience of feeling empathy, but Alice's condition and her son's had nothing in common. Now, the NDM argument owed its existence to the recognition of Asperger's as boundaries around the conditions grew. But then in 2013, Asperger's diagnosis was killed off anyway by the DSM. It no longer exists because of continued doubts about the usefulness of the concept. So I think this is probably a good place to stop. I am actually almost at the end of this, by the way, but this is going to run out of me. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you for watching.